When you start scrolling through gaming PC listings, it's easy to feel that knot in your stomach. You see the glossy renders, the flashy RGB, the promise of ultra-high frame rates, and you wonder whether any of it will actually translate to a smooth night of Battle Royale or a marathon RPG session. The frustration is real. So many pre-built rigs look perfect on paper, only to disappoint when you finally plug them in, dealing with bottlenecks, noisy fans, or a cramped case that never fits your peripherals. I'm going to walk through the Skytech Gaming Azure 3 desktop PC, lay out what you'll actually get on the desk, and help you decide if it's worth the cash, or if you'd be better off building or buying something else. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the Azure 3 isn't a budget-friendly machine. It's positioned as a high-end pre-built, targeting serious gamers who want the latest console-level performance without assembling the parts themselves. The centerpiece is an AMD Ryzen 7 7700X, a 8-core, 16-thread CPU that can turbo up to 5.4 GHz. Pair that with an NVIDIA RTX 5070 Skytech's naming convention suggests the card is a step up from the previous generation RTX 3070, boasting 12 GB of GDDR5 memory. On paper that looks like a dream for 1440p or even solid 4K gaming. But the real question is, does the whole system actually deliver that performance in everyday use, and where does it fall short? I started by looking at how the Azure 3 handles a typical gaming setup. My test bench was a 27-inch 1440p monitor, a mechanical keyboard, and a mouse I already own. Out of the box, the PC boots straight into Windows 11 without any of the usual pre-installed trialware that some other brands still ship. That's a small but welcome convenience. The Wi-Fi 802.11 AC module connects instantly, and the system recognizes the 1TB Gen 4 NVMe SSD right away. In my first launch of a popular open-world title, Elden Ring *, the loading screens dropped from the usual 8-second wait to barely 23 seconds. That speed is directly thanks to that Gen 4 SSD, which has a real impact when you're constantly hopping between large game worlds. When it comes to the actual frame rates, the RTX 5070 lives up to most of its claims. In Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p with ultra settings, I hovered around 7075 frames per second, which is smooth enough that you can disable motion blur and enjoy the cinematic visuals. In a fast-paced shooter like Valorant the FPS was easily north of 150, which means you'll never feel throttled even in high-intensity matches. That said, the card isn't a magical cure for every bottleneck. In titles that are heavily CPU-bound, such as Starfield during massive space station traffic, the 7700X does its best, but you'll see occasional dips into the low 90s. If you plan on streaming while you play, you'll need to allocate a portion of the 32 GB DDR5 RAM to the encoder, which still leaves plenty of headroom for most games. But you'll notice the difference compared to a dedicated streaming PC. One area that surprised me was the cooling. Skytech equipped the Azure 3 with a 360mm AIO Liquid Cooler, complete with ARGB lighting that syncs with the case's front strip. The cooler is surprisingly quiet. Under load, the fans spin at about 2000 revolutions per minute, and the system stays under 55 C even during a full-frame stress test in benchmark Sweet Star. That is a real advantage if you hate hearing your PC roar when you're trying to focus on a narrative-driven game or a video call. The trade-off is that the radiator occupies the top of the case, which means you can't easily swap out the cooler for a custom loop later without a bit of work. If you're the type who likes to tinker with cooling or wants to replace the AIO down the line, you'll need to consider that the case design isn't as modular as a typical mid-tower. Another practical point is the power supply. The 850W gold-rated ATX 3 PSU provides enough headroom for future upgrades, and the gold certification means you're getting decent efficiency without burning excess electricity. However, the PSU is not modular, so you have a bundle of cables snaking behind the motherboard tray. For most users this won't be a major issue, but if you're particular about cable management, you'll notice a bit of clutter compared to a fully modular unit. Now, who should actually buy the Azure 3? If you're a gamer who wants a rear play machine that can handle the newest AAA titles at high settings, and you don't want to wrestle with BIOS updates, BIOS flashing, or figuring out which RAM kit pairs best with your motherboard, this rig is a solid choice. It also works well for content creators who need a strong GPU for video editing or 3D rendering, because the RTX 5070's CUDA cores accelerate many of those workloads. The inclusion of 32GB of DDR5 RAM is generous for both gaming and productivity, and the 1TB Gen 4 SSD gives you ample space for several large games and fast access to media files. On the flip